Greetings, this is Rebecca McCarthy once again for CMST245 online at South Seattle Community College. Hello and welcome. This is going to be the last major podcast for the class. And in this particular podcast, I'm going to go over Chapter 7, Anti-Institutional Politics Online, Activism, Hacktivism, and Digital Confrontation. And basically the authors are going back or going to start with this idea of a counterpublic. And so because of that, it'd be very helpful, I think, if you went back to the very first chapter in Rhetoric Online, The Politics of New Media, and to read the section again on counterpublics. That can be found on page 9, but let me read a little bit about counterpublics so that we can refresh our memory of what this concept means. The authors write the following. One way of thinking about those groups whose actions might fall outside of the scope of the public sphere is to consider the concept of counterpublics. If, according to a traditional Habermasian view, the ideal public sphere is formed around principles of consensus, rationality, and equality, then a counterpublic is formed around principles of disagreement, practicality, and division. In this way, counterpublics can be understood as coming together of those individuals, ideas, and discursive exclusions that cannot or do not circulate within a particular dominant public sphere. So I want you to go ahead and probably reread that section on counterpublics. It's just a few pages long, spanning page 9, 10, and 11, really, and 12, a bit of 12. And just to go ahead and familiarize yourself. Their example of how the Tea Party started as a counterpublic movement, but soon became part of a movement that is now considered more mainstream is a very important example. So you might want to refresh your memory on that as well. So again, the title for Chapter 7 is Anti-Institutional Politics Online, and you'll notice that one of the very first things that our authors do is to identify and to define this concept of anti-institutional politics, and they define it as unconventional, unsanctioned political practices aimed at challenging established institutional power structures. Now, through most of their book, they've looked at, if you will, established institutional power structures and how they use different rhetorical means online in order to create identity with me and you. So now they're going to look at counterpublics and how counterpublics actually function. Now, one of the first things they looked at is hacktivism, and this is a very interesting kind of counterpublic. And let me rephrase that, because hacktivism really isn't necessarily a counterpublic, but a tool used by a counterpublic. Hacktivism, as the authors define it, is a politically motivated hacking. Hacking itself is to change something into something it is not meant to be. The dictionary actually defines hack as cutting with rough or heavy blows, or a rough cut, blow, or stroke. And in a sense, when a counterpublic is using hacktivism or a type of hack, what they are trying to do is to break down or to cut the institutional norm in which is being protested. In this sense, a hack is against the institutional norms. As our author writes, hacktivism is political action that doesn't adhere to traditional American standards of deliberation, such as voting, appeals to elected representatives, the use of courts, public marches, and so on and so forth. So, in a sense, hacktivism often has been framed as being undemocratic and an undemocratic way of actually protesting. But protesters and many people who utilize hacktivism, they feel that they cannot work within the institutional norm that is the normal public sphere in order to change or to effect change. Indeed, they often feel that if they were to work within the institutional norm, what would happen is they would no longer be a counterpublic, but they would actually become part of the normal public. They'd become part of the machine and so therefore become ineffectual. In a sense, when we were looking at the earlier chapter about the Tea Party and how the Tea Party started out as a counterpublic, but through the use of having officials actually actually be elected into the government, they stopped being a counterpublic and started being assumed into the machine itself, into the mechanism of government itself, that they've lost some of their power for being a counterculture group, if that makes any sense. So some people, though, who feel that working outside of the system is a bad thing, they often see hacktivism as nothing more than a form of terror and a form of creating terror because you are raging against the machine, to use a popular song title, or you are challenging the way things are normally done within the public sphere itself. So it is important, I think, to keep this understanding that some counterculture groups feel like they need to work outside of the system, that they need to offer radical resistance in order to create change. Because if they worked inside of the system, they would become part of the machine and therefore would no longer be able to enact change. And so our authors are far more interested in those who go towards radical resistance rather than those people who protest in what might be considered a legal or acceptive way. Now, once again, they do a fantastic job of defining important ideas and terms for us. So let's look at some of the terms that they define for us and how they set up this chapter. The first thing is they define traditional forms of protest. And these traditional forms, especially for war protests, include worker strikes, filibustering, and various peaceful forms of conscience raising. And as long as most of these protests become peaceful and law-abiding, they are normally accepted. It is once they deviate from the accepted norms that what we have is considered radical. And when we look at radical, they want to look at the term of radicalism and what does it mean? Because historically, as they point out on page 115, radicalism is a term that has had many different meanings. On the one level, it could be associated with revolution. But at this point, they're trying to differentiate radicalism from ideas of socialism and anarchism. And so in that sense, radicalism does not look for a state to be dissolved, but they're looking to change certain aspects of the state itself. And so they also look at the fact that radical movements will draw on the spirit of antagonism, which could be understood as frequently hostile, impassionate response that results from tensions between conflicting and disparate politics, ethics, and ideology. So there's almost a need to create a form of antagonism within the radical politics in order to promote or include change. Along with antagonism is the process of subversion, and I'm reading from page 116. Subversion that stops society and the institutional forces that shapes everyday experiences from achieving permanence. Antagonism keeps things fluctuating and uneasily. And it's important. This fluctuation, this attempt to create instability within a stable society is important because creating this type of chaos allows people who are challenging the norm or the status quo to be able to invent new solutions. And they'll spend a little bit of time defining this word, invention, as well. Don't you love it how they do a lot of defining? When radical groups work to keep things in flux and uneasy by employing a form of antagonism, what they're doing is they're opening up the ability to have new practices to challenge the old practices, and that's the ability to invent new ways to get things done. Now, this relates to the idea of phronesis, which is the intelligent understanding of contingency that guides praxis in an open social field. So the idea is here that in practical life, in everyday life, we have to adjust our practices or how we do things depending upon the contingent situation at hand. And when we create chaos, we allow ourselves to break old habits and create a room to invent new habits. And of course, that is what, of course, a lot of radical groups want to do. They want to challenge the way things are dealt or done with in this world, and now, today, for example, and they want to offer suggestions about how we could go about doing them differently. Going back to hackers, it is understood in this chapter that radical politics are found in actual hacktivism. And so The authors offer us 4 historical examples of hackers who engaged the military in order to break into systems and free information, or to protest certain military actions that are indicative of this long-standing confrontation. And of course, I was reading from our textbook there on page 117. I'm going to go ahead and let you look at these examples specifically yourself, but you can find the 4 examples from page 117 all the way through 120. We have the attack on the Department of Defense computer infrastructures by hackers. There is a discussion about the 1996 defacements of the Department of Justice and the CIA homepage. They also talk about the defacement of the Department of Labor and Health and Human Services websites by Chinese hackers, and that occurred in 2001. And then finally, the 2002 arrest of Gary McKenna for entering NASA and the U.S. Navy, Army, Air Force, and Pentagon system itself. Now, starting on page 21, the authors look at the construction of cyber terrorism as a rhetorical term. And this started in 1997 through 1999 and Clinton's administration of the Cyber Corps program. Now, cyber-terrorism as a term occurred at this point in time, and what's interesting about this term is that this is the moment where we create a common enemy, a rhetorical enemy, against a counter-culture group, such as those who fall under the realm of cyber-terrorism. And I will discuss that a little bit more specifically in part 2 of this series of podcasts regarding anti-institutional politics. Until then, I will see you on the boards. Goodbye.